When I think of Dragon Knights, usually the first thing I think of is their amazing Dragon Leap ultimate. And since I'm thinking of Dragon Knights and ultimates, usually the next thing I think of is their also amazing Battle Roar passive. The focus of this build is to exploit that mechanic of generating ultimate and cashing it in for resources as much as possible. This turns out to be such an effective sustain tool that it really isn't necessary to invest in sustain anywhere else in the build, which allows us to focus on other things like damage or defense. It's a really great bruiser or brawler build. It can take a pretty good pounding while dishing out quite a lot of damage. It can be very punishing, and taking risks is often rewarded with a favorable outcome. I think it's a great build for players who are maybe somewhat new to PvP because the gear is all very easy to get, and once you get the hang of how the build plays, it's pretty simple yet very effective. It's good for playing solo or in groups, and it just feels very much like a Dragon Knight. For my race, I'm a Nord, which I really do think is the only good option for this build. For most builds, I would normally say there are multiple good options for the race, but since ultimate regeneration is so important to this build, Nord is by far the best choice due to their stalwart passive. Plus, all their other passives are really perfect for the Dragon Knight's playstyle. For the Munas Stone, we're using the Warrior. For our food, we're using standard purple tri-stat food, and for potions, we're using standard tri-stat potions. Here are the stats. You'll see the unbuffed stats on the left and the fully buffed stats on the right. I'll also put a link to the UESP build in the description so you can take a closer look at the stats or anything else about the build if you want. A quick overview of the gear. I'm using Bloodspawn as my monster set, Champion of the Hist as one of my 5-piece sets, and the Witchman's Armor as the other 5-piece. I'm running 5 medium, 1 heavy, 1 light, all impenetrable. For the jewelry, I'm doing 3 protective traits and all weapon damage glyphs on all 3 pieces. For my weapons, I'm doing a decisive maul on the front bar with a weapon damage glyph, and on the back bar I'm doing a sword and shield. The sword is decisive and the shield is sturdy. So let's start with the Witchman's Armor. This set seems to have been made for a Dragon Knight. The 5-piece bonus is kind of like a miniature version of the Battle Roar passive. And when combined with Battle Roar, it gives back a pretty good amount of resources. Now, that alone I don't think would be enough sustain on its own, but if you can generate ultimate fast enough and cash in that ultimate quickly enough, then it is. And so that's kind of the crux of the build. We're going to generate ultimate very, very fast, and then between Battle Roar and this set right here, we're getting a whole bunch of resources back, and at a pretty high frequency. And as I mentioned earlier, this ends up being ample sustain, so we can invest in other things like damage and defense in our build otherwise. So this set is a big reason why the build is able to hit hard and be tanky at the same time. The other 5-piece set is Champion of the Hist. The 5-piece bonus gives us minor heroism at all times, which is of course very nice for an ulti-gen focused build. We can just get that ultimate all the faster and cash in on that Battle Roar plus Witchman's Armor resource return all the more frequently. And the other stats it gives us are also very nice. And of course, no Dragon Knight build is complete without Bloodspawn for the monster set. It gives us lots of resistance, it gives us lots of ultimate regeneration. It really is a match made in heaven, and it just so happens to be perfect for this build. I'm running 5 medium, 1 heavy, 1 light because I want to get the most out of the Undaunted Metal passive, because I think this build really benefits from having large stat pools. For the same reason, I'm also running tri-stat glyphs on all 7 armor pieces. The jewelry traits are flexible. There are a lot of good options, but I like 3 protective because the extra resistance plus the resistance I get from being a Nord and Bloodspawn is quite a lot of resistance for a medium armor build. We're pretty tanky while still getting to take advantage of all those medium armor passives. But some other good traits are Infuse, Triune, or even just leaving them healthy, which is how they come. It's also a good option. For my main two-hander, I'm using a Maul for the extra 20% penetration. And I'm using the decisive trait because with the rate at which we regenerate ultimate, we actually get quite a bit out of this trait. I find it to be just that little bit of extra ultimate regen I need in the build to make the sustain feel comfortable. And I'm using a weapon damage glyph on the front bar just to get the maximum possible uptime on that glyph on the bar where I'm doing the most damage. On the back bar, I'm using a one hand and shield, mainly for the shield charge ability. I just find a lot of value in having a gap closer and a stun on the same bar slot. And also, of course, the defensive capabilities we get from the passives are also very nice. I'm still using the decisive trait, even though the potency is cut in half on one-handed weapons, I still think it's worth using. And the shield is sturdy with a stamina glyph. With Champion of the Hist, Bloodspawn, decisive weapons, and our Nord passive, we generate about 7 ultimate per second while in active combat. That may not sound like much, but that equates to being able to use our Dragon Leap about once every 17 seconds. And that's not even counting Banish the Wicked or the Combat Frenzy passive, so if we're actually getting kills, then we'll be generating ult much faster than that. For my main spammable, I'm using Wrecking Blow. I like that this ability kind of rewards skillful gameplay by giving you M power and thus making your light attack weaves all stronger. Plus it looks cool and hits really hard. I'm using Executioner for my finisher, Camo Hunter for a bunch of extra passive damage. I'm using Rally for my major damage buff, and it also offers a very strong burst heal, so be sure and keep that active at all times. Of course, every stamina build has to have Resolving Vigor. And for my main front bar ultimate, I'm using Ferocious Leap. Now, I know this is technically the Magicka version of this ultimate, but since this is a non-CP build, the damage loss is pretty small, and the huge damage shield that it provides can really come in clutch sometimes. On the back bar, I'm using Protective Plate for the snare immunity, and the 50% damage reduction against projectiles is actually very powerful. I think a lot of people underestimate this ability. Mainly using Nauseous Breath for the AoE Major Fracture, and it also makes a pretty decent anti-stealth tool. Invasion is a gap closer and a stun on the same bar slot, which I think is great because it just opens up space for other abilities. Volatile Armor, this is where we get our major resistance buffs. It also deals damage in a 10-meter radius, and even though it's a very small amount of damage, since it's a 10-meter radius, it actually makes a really good anti-stealth tool. Using Cauterize for some extra healing over time. It can also be used as a spammable in a pinch. If you're low on stamina and need to heal up, you can use Magicka to spam this ability instead. It's usually not necessary to do that, but it is an option that has saved me a handful of times. And I'm using Corrosive Armor for my back bar ultimate. This is a really great ult. Most of the time I use Leap, but there are definitely times when I'm glad I have Corrosive slotted. What's nice about being a Dragon Knight is the higher cost is actually a good thing, because the higher the cost, the more resources we get back when we use it. So it can be a great ultimate to use when you're like on the brink of death and really low on resources. Use this ult and suddenly your resources are 100% full. You're basically unkillable for 12 seconds. And you have 100% penetration during that time as well. Now, the penetration only applies to direct damage, but aside from Nauseous Breath, direct damage is all we have, so it's really not a problem. The main combo is pretty simple. You basically just ram them with your shield charge, debuff them with Nauseous Breath, then swap to the front bar and charge up a heavy attack into a Wrecking Blow, followed immediately by a Ferocious Leap if it's ready. If not, then just keep light attack weaving Wrecking Blow, and when they get into execute range around 25% health, finish them off with Executioner. Pretty simple. So that's the build, and I think that concludes the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have anything you'd like to ask or share, feel free to leave a comment or email me at ketsparrowhawk@gmail.com. You can also look me up on Twitter at Ket Sparrowhawk. Until next time, good luck out there.